They said it was a place of God. But the ground beneath Sacred Heart Seminary was never holy. It was hungry. In the first winter of 1847, 3 men arrived on 400 acres of prairie outside Chicago with cassocks, crosses, and no past. They claimed Ireland, but no parish knew them. They claimed letters of holy appointment, but none were ever authenticated. What they brought was certainty, voices that could command silence, and eyes that could make guilt rise in a man's chest, like steam from snow-covered earth. That same winter, the ground opened its first mouth. Sacred Heart wasn't built as a school. It was built as a system. The stone chapel, the cells, the underground tunnels, none of it matched traditional seminary plans. There were chambers with no purpose, corridors that looped into nowhere. Some said the architect was mad. Others said he wasn't an architect at all. And when the sun set, the walls inside the seminary creaked, not like old wood, but like something inside was shifting. Over 15 years, 17 priests disappeared. The Vatican called them transfers. But no one ever saw them again. Not in Ireland, not in Rome, not even in the dirt. You won't find their names on church rosters or gravestones. Their families stopped receiving letters. Their personal effects vanished. And those who asked too many questions, well, they were transferred too. But last year, during a restoration project, workers uncovered something beneath the chapel floor. Not bones, not records, but letters, written in blood-dark ink, some torn in rage mid-sentence, others hidden inside hollowed-out missals. One read, "This place is not of Christ. It is a gate." The Catholic Church sealed the seminary's records for 150 years. Tonight, we break the seal. If you've made it this far, you're not just here for a ghost story. You're here for what hides beneath it, for the mechanisms of control, the routine. You all's behind the rituals, the institutional masks that turn devils into saints and history into a weapon. You're not watching by accident. You've already started to remember something your ancestors forgot, on purpose. What you're about to hear has been buried for over a century. Buried because it threatens the foundation of more than just faith. It threatens the very idea that some men are chosen and others are used. This is the truth behind Sacred Heart Seminary, and once you hear it, you won't pray the same way again. They always disappear in the winter. That's what one of the recovered letters said. A torn scrap buried beneath a flagstone in the chapel vestibule. They always disappear in the winter, when the wind howls and the snow silences God. And when you examine the dates, Michael Brennan, February 1848. Thomas Gallagher, March. Elian Costa, December. 17 in total, all vanished between November and March. But it wasn't the cold that took them. It was the calendar. Winter at Sacred Heart wasn't just a season. It was the ritual. You have to understand, the seminary was never built for education. It was built for isolation, for control, for disappearance. Young men were plucked from devout Catholic families across the Midwest, German, Irish, French, even Protestant converts, and placed under a vow of silence, masquerading as discipline. Letters were censored, visiting hours restricted, punishment was swift, often spiritualized, and always unseen. The records show a perfect illusion: structured study, morning mass, manual labor, austerity. But beneath the surface, a different curriculum unfolded: obedience training, sensory deprivation, penitential fasting, psychological isolation. The false priests, Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien, were not educators. They were handlers. Their job was to fracture identity and rebuild it into silence, into compliance. They didn't teach the Word of God. They erased the self. One student wrote, "I no longer know where God ends and Father Walsh begins." This wasn't theology. It was programming. You think that sounds paranoid? Let me tell you what else they found. Journals filled with detailed notes, handwriting matched to O'Brien, outlining which students responded best to pressure, which broke under guilt, which still clung to hope. It was a harvest log, a human audit, names checked off one by one. And the rituals, they weren't Catholic. They the form, prayer, Latin incantations, incense, but inverted the meaning. One former seminarian described midnight reflection sessions in the basement chapel. Candles arranged in 7-point configurations, readings from books with no Latin roots. He said the air would taste like copper, and the walls would breathe. How did this go unnoticed? Because the church needed them. Walsh and his men provided something far more valuable than sermons, compliant vessels. Young men, trained not to preach, but to obey. And once the training was done, they were transferred, but no records ever indicated where. And now you know why the ground was always hungry in winter. The seminary was not a school, it was a system, and it still is. There was no burial ground at Sacred Heart. Not officially. For a Catholic seminary, that's unheard of. Every other institution had consecrated soil, land set aside for those who died in service of God. But Sacred Heart had no grave markers, no funeral records, not even a chapel ledger entry for the 17 young men who transferred in the dead of winter. What they did have were sinkholes, small ones, carefully maintained, hidden under the orchard planted behind the old refectory. Local farmers knew something was wrong. As early as 1852, a letter surfaced in the Millfield Town Archive, written by a carpenter who'd been hired to fix the seminary's drainage system. He said the ground near the rear entrance had an unholy softness to it, that his horse refused to step near it, that when he tapped the soil with his boot, it echoed. He was never paid, and within weeks, he'd moved his entire family to Wisconsin. They always ran. The few who got close enough to feel it, that quiet hum under the chapel floor, like a second heart beating beneath the building, they all left town. Some spoke in hushed tones of the breath of the buried. Others claimed to hear prayers in reverse at night. One boy, a stable hand, reportedly lost his mind after seeing 3 figures carry a long shrouded form down into the wine cellar. They told him it was a statue delivery. But Sacred Heart never had statues. What they did have was a locked sub-basement, one that didn't appear on the blueprints, accessed only through a trapdoor behind the altar. That door was sealed in 1871 after a failed fire inspection. The report noted anomalous structural irregularities and recommended the entire southern wing be demolished. It never was, because by then, the diocese had buried the story, along with whatever else was down there. You're beginning to see the truth, aren't you? This wasn't a bow, but a few rogue priests. This was institutional, systemic, designed. The seminary was a prototype, a blueprint for something much older and much more coordinated. Look at the pattern across time. Children taken under religious pretense, minds broken in isolation, bodies disposed with ritual precision, and all of it wrapped in the language of virtue, of God, of salvation. It's not that the church didn't know. It's that they approved. The deeper you go, the harder it is to breathe. But you asked for truth. So let's keep going. In 1853, the third disappearance came, and with it, the first letter smuggled out. It was written in trembling Latin by a student named Lucien Dupré. Son of a wealthy French merchant family in St. Louis, Lucien had been known for his quiet devotion and almost monastic discipline. But that fall, his demeanor changed. He stopped speaking during meals, avoided eye contact, spent long hours in the orchard, staring into the soil as if it whispered back. Then, 1 week before his disappearance, the letter was found. Not mailed, not addressed, just folded neatly beneath the loose floorboard of the Millfield Library's theology section, a place only seminary students visited. Local historians wouldn't find it until 1912. Here's what it said. There are screams beneath the choir that no hymn can silence. The priests walk with ash on their shoes. My blood is not my own anymore. When I sleep, I wake with scripture carved into my arms. They say I volunteered, but I did not speak. There was no signature, just a symbol, a double cross with thorns. It doesn't match any Catholic order, but it does match carvings found later in the chapel's foundation stones, symbols that shouldn't be there. Lucien vanished 3 days after the last snowfall of December. Father Walsh claimed he'd had a mental breakdown and was escorted to a sanatorium in Indiana. No transport records exist, no admissions logs, and when Lucien's parents traveled to Sacred Heart for answers, they were turned away at the gate. The next morning, their store in St. Louis burned to the ground. Arson, never solved. You think that's coincidence? Lucien's father had threatened to go to the press, and the fire came the next day. This was a chessboard, and every piece was placed with strategy. The victims weren't random. They were leverage points. Sons of merchants, scholars, landowners, each chosen not just for utility, but for their potential silence. Their families could be bought, threatened, or ruined. One by one, they vanished. One by one, the community grew more afraid. But you can only hide so many bodies. You can only write so many lies. And when the fourth student disappeared, someone tried to fight back. But what happened next was far worse. By 1854, Sacred Heart was no longer a seminary. It was a fortress. Windows shuttered from within. Students escorted in pairs, never alone. Letters home dictated and censored. And beneath the illusion of holy rigor, something monstrous was growing. The fourth disappearance didn't go quietly. His name was Elias Harper, 21 years old, raised on a Kentucky tobacco farm. His family wasn't wealthy, but he'd been sponsored by a bishop impressed with his raw intellect and photographic memory. Elias could recite entire passages from Aquinas and Augustine after a single reading. He was devout, obedient, until he wasn't. It started with a sermon. Father Walsh had delivered a homily on obedience. How disobedience was the first sin. How even angels fell because they questioned order. Most students listened quietly. Elias did not. He stood in front of 60 others and said calmly, "Obedience to evil is not holiness." You could hear the breath leave the chapel. Father Walsh didn't rebuke him, didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Elias and said, "Stay after Mass." He did. And he was never seen again. But this time, they made a mistake. That night, while the seminary slept, Elias's roommate, Miguel Santos, a Mexican-American convert from Texas, snuck into the administrative wing. He'd seen Elias dragged from their dorm by 2 priests. He waited an hour, then followed the flickering lantern light to the records room. What he found was more than he could comprehend. Hidden behind the filing cabinet, a false panel, a narrow stairwell descending into stone. And beyond that, rooms that weren't on any floor plan, cells, Chains, blood on the floor thick as syrup, clothing, rosaries snapped in half. Miguel didn't make it far. He heard voices, laughter. Not the kind that comes from joy, but the kind that comes from power. He fled. But he didn't run away. There's a silence that descends when terror becomes routine, a dead, resigned hush that spreads like mold. By 1856, Sacred Heart Seminary existed in that silence. No student dared walk alone. No one asked where the missing went. Even the chapel, once the heartbeat of the grounds, felt hollow. Its sermons rehearsed, its prayers trembling in the mouths of men who no longer believed they'd be heard. And yet, they stayed. Because the real prison wasn't the stone walls. It was the psychological design. Every rule was laced with contradiction. Discipline was called love. Obedience was framed as freedom. Pain was the refinement of the soul. And silence, especially silence, was the highest form of worship. This was not education. It was conditioning. The kind perfected by centuries of inquisitions and cloisters, now weaponized in the name of piety. But one man saw through it. The last man to disappear. His name was Nathaniel Cross. He was unlike the others. Older, 28, a former Methodist minister who had converted to Catholicism after what he described as a voice in the dark, educated at Yale, brilliant, intense, and dangerous to anyone trying to control him. Nathaniel didn't just question the seminary's teachings, he challenged their foundation. He asked why no correspondence ever reached home. He asked why records from Rome never arrived. He asked why certain doors were always locked, and why at night he could hear whispers in Latin echoing from beneath the floorboards, rituals that weren't found in any Catholic liturgy. One night, he followed the whispers. Through the crypt chapel. Down the hidden stairwell behind the altar. He never came back. But what he left behind would unravel the entire illusion. Hidden in the spine of his theological dissertation, a treatise on free will and divine secrecy, was a note addressed to any man who still has EE. Truth doesn't stay buried. It waits. It decays. Then it erupts, always when the world least expects it. In 1866, 10 years after Nathaniel Cross's death, a storm struck central Illinois. Lightning cleaved the chapel's steeple at Sacred Heart in two, igniting a fire that devoured half the building by dawn. But what emerged from the ash was not just charred stone. It was a secret the church had failed to fully bury. While clearing the debris, local workers discovered a sealed chamber behind the altar, walled off by hand-hewn limestone and mortar centuries older than the rest of the structure. The smell hit first. Sweet, rotting, metallic. Inside were 17 nameplates, one for each of the missing priests. Stacked in rows like trophies. But there were no bones, no bodies. Only cassocks, rosaries, letters, teeth. It was a reliquary, not to honor but to erase. The items were carefully curated. Each relic corresponded with a disappearance. Michael Brennan's silver rosary, Thomas Gallagher's unfinished letter to his sister, Nathaniel's pocket watch, still ticking, somehow, buried beneath a pile of singed prayer books. Investigators, mostly local men, were horrified. But within hours, their access was revoked. A convoy from the Archdiocese of Chicago arrived unannounced, led by a man known only in Vatican archives, Monsignor Raphael Vitelli. He carried no identification, only a crimson ring and a parchment bearing the papal seal. The workers were paid in gold, and silence. The chamber was resealed. The ashes, removed under cover of night and loaded onto Vatican-marked carriages. None of it made the papers. Not a single obituary, not a whisper on the local pulpit. But here's what they didn't count on. One of the workers, Thomas Red Mallory, kept something. A journal, 17 pages. Each dedicated to one of the missing men. Red had seen their faces. They're true. You've heard the stories of missing men. But what if I told you some didn't disappear, some were reclaimed. It began subtly. Quiet rumors drifting across parishes in Missouri, Indiana, and Ohio of young priests appearing unannounced, claiming transfers from Sacred Heart Seminary. Men who spoke perfect Latin but stumbled through basic English, who quoted obscure scripture with chilling precision but seemed void behind the eyes. They performed Mass with flawless ritual. Their sermons were hypnotic, mechanical, emotionally sterile, yet strangely magnetic. Parishioners described feeling lightheaded in their presence, forgetting their own names during confession. Children cried during communion without knowing why. And then, they too began vanishing. One parish reported that Father Aidan March, supposedly from Sacred Heart, presided for just 31 days before vanishing mid-sermon. The crucifix on the altar was found upside down. The chalice, bone dry. His room had been cleared of all belongings. No forwarding address. No records. Another comma, Father Kilroy was said to have removed the eyes of every statue in the church within his first week, claiming they watched too much. He too vanished. And when local bishops sought records from Sacred Heart for these men, none existed. Why? Because they weren't part of the church anymore. If they ever had been, there's a term buried in the apocryphal Vatican archives, praeteritus. It means one who has been passed over and returned wrong. Priests who entered training in good faith but were broken open by something summoned, something ancient, and something no one should have tried to control. The real purpose of Sacred Heart Seminary wasn't ordination. It was extraction. Extracting obedience, extracting identity, extracting the divine spark and replacing it with something that spoke in sacred tones. But the disappearances didn't end when Sacred Heart Seminary burned. In fact, that fire may have been the beginning of something far worse. Because the church didn't close the doors. They simply moved them. Records uncovered in 1932 by Father Raymond O'Donnell, an internal Vatican investigator, suggested that after the fire, 3 of the seminary's surviving administrators were quietly reassigned, not excommunicated, not tried, not even questioned. Reassigned. To where? A new institution, Our Lady of the Hollow Cross, nestled deep in the Ozark Mountains. Privately funded, papal oversight, and completely off the map. No charter, no diocesan connection, just land, money, and secrecy. And what was built there wasn't a school. It was a containment facility. You see, by the 1870s, word had spread through ecclesiastical inner circles about the 17, not their names, not their fate. Just the number. Whispers in the Vatican described them as unreclaimed vessels, beings who had once been priests, but now existed in a liminal state, somewhere between man and function. Their thoughts weren't their own. Their memories, fragmented. But they still obeyed. What they obeyed, however, wasn't God. Father O'Donnell's private journals, never published, describe a horrifying experiment conducted at Our Lady of the Hollow Cross in 1879. A small group of former Sacred Heart students, assumed lost, had been reintegrated, given new identities, paraded before visiting bishops to prove that rehabilitation was possible. But according to O'Donnell's account, none of the bishops remembered the visit afterward. None. Even worse, one of the bishops, the Most Reverend Anthony Carlucci of Cincinnati, was found dead 2 days later in his cathedral office. Both eyes removed. His blood used to paint a symbol on the floor, a key inside an eye. And here's where the story fractures further. There is a silence in history that's not accidental. Not oversight. Not neglect. It's engineered. After the Hollow Cross incident, something changed, not in the church's behavior, but in how it operated. Gone were the grand seminaries, the visible constructions of holy architecture. In their place came quiet systems, networks of orphanages, monastic farms, re-education compounds tucked into forgotten terrain, each funded through shadow accounts that bypassed traditional church governance entirely. Who funded them? Not tithes. Not Rome. Private donors. Names you've heard, but not in this context. The DuPonts. The Astors. A few elite banking families with roots in Venetian bloodlines, names erased from history books, but deeply tied to pre-Vatican magical theology and psychological ritual. What they built was a matrix of control disguised as redemption. And into that matrix went the remaining graduates of Sacred Heart's experimental class, now scattered, renamed, indoctrinated. But there's a problem with programming a man's faith. It leaves behind residue. Things the architects of control couldn't fully scrub out. One such man resurfaced in 1893 at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. A silent worker at the St. Gabriel Pavilion, cleaning confessionals. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. But dozens of witnesses reported the same thing. He wrote sermons backward. Entire passages in reverse Latin, etched into wooden walls using just a fingernail. When translated, they weren't scripture, but warnings. One of them read, "We were not taught the gospel. We were taught obedience. Beneath the cross lies the engine. Pray not. Flee." The man vanished days later. Pavilion records list his name as Thomas M., but no birth records, no parish assignment, no trail. The last known photograph shows him standing behind a visiting cardinal, eyes unfocused. The chamber called Cradle beneath Sacred Heart was no ordinary room. Archaeologists who later tried to excavate its location were met with fierce opposition, legal threats, unexplained accidents, and even disappearances. One team, funded by a private Catholic historical society in the early 1980s, began digging near the seminary's ruins. They uncovered charred wooden beams, old iron shackles, and something else. A meticulously carved stone altar, etched with symbols that didn't belong to any Christian tradition. Instead, they resembled ancient sigils from Celtic pagan rites, symbols meant to invoke binding, submission, and eternal silence. Before they could proceed, the excavation site was bulldozed overnight. The official reason: hazardous structural instability. But insiders whispered a different story. That the chamber was a site of ritualistic indoctrination designed to break the souls of those trapped inside. The 17 missing priests were not merely kidnapped. They were sacrificed to a system that transformed faith into a weapon of psychological submission. The men who ran Sacred Heart, the 3 false priests, weren't just criminals. They were operatives of a hidden agenda, tasked with creating obedient soldiers of faith. Men who could enforce control over masses, not through love or devotion, but through fear and manipulation. And this system didn't end in 1862. It evolved. Disguised within modern seminaries, cloaked behind layers of tradition, silence, and secrecy. Whispers of disappearances continued in the 20th century. Tied to certain elite religious schools. The Church's official line remains: no evidence. But survivors, those rare few who escaped the system, tell a different tale. Of brainwashing. Of ritual humiliation. Of the erasure of free will. Tonight, you have glimpsed the tip of a dangerous iceberg. One where the silence that cloaked Sacred Heart Seminary was more than just absence of sound. It was the echo of countless broken lives swallowed by a ruthless machine. After those first disappearances, a chilling pattern emerged. Every year, without fail, one by one, promising young men vanished, not lost to the wilderness or illness as the official reports insisted, but swallowed whole by an invisible system designed to erase their very existence. This was a deliberate, calculated design, a dark choreography orchestrated by the 3 false priests, Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien, who wielded power with a merciless grip. Their network extended beyond the seminary walls, into the shadowy veins of local government, law enforcement, and clandestine criminal syndicates. These were not isolated abductions. They were parts of an unholy transaction, human trafficking under the guise of spiritual salvation. The seminary's architectural grandeur hid secret passages and underground tunnels, discovered only decades later by accidental explorers and dismissed as urban legend by the Church. These passages served as arteries, moving the disappeared boys to hidden locations where their fates twisted into darkness. Forced labor, experimentation, or worse. But what was the end game? Why target these young men, steeped in faith and devoted to God? Because they were prime vessels for control, educated, obedient, and isolated from outside influence. These young priests were to be molded into unassailable pillars of the Church's dominion. Their loyalty wasn't born of genuine belief, but of terror and conditioning. Once broken, their silence ensured the system's survival. What's more sinister is how this pattern of control didn't end in the 19th century. The very methods pioneered at Sacred Heart resurfaced in later decades, cloaked in modern psychology and institutional discipline, seminaries and religion. The disappearance of the priests was only the surface of an ocean of darkness that engulfed Sacred Heart Seminary. Beneath the institution's pious facade lurked a network of coercion and mind control techniques, crafted to break down individuality and forge unwavering obedience. This was not just spiritual discipline, it was psychological warfare. The three false priests wielded their knowledge of human nature with surgical precision. Isolation was the first weapon. Students were severed from family, friends, and any outside counsel that could offer solace or perspective. Letters were censored. Visits were controlled. Their world shrank to the walls of the seminary, to the stone chapel where whispered prayers masked whispered threats. Sleep deprivation, public humiliation, and physical punishment were daily rituals disguised as spiritual penance. Confession became an interrogation, a means to extract secrets, fears, and weaknesses. And those who showed resistance or questioned authority were branded as sinners or heretics, broken under the weight of institutional shame. But the true horror was the indoctrination, a relentless assault on the mind, eroding free will and replacing it with blind allegiance. Students were taught to associate loyalty with survival, dissent with eternal damnation. Their identities were erased, replaced with a manufactured holiness designed to serve the unseen masters, pulling the strings. Over time, some students began to vanish not just physically but mentally, lost to psychosis, despair, or indoctrinated fanaticism. The seminary became a factory of obedience, churning out vessels primed for exploitation. These methods were chillingly effective, and the echoes of this dark blueprint can still be found in various institutions cloaked in sanctity today. The same systems of control, psychological manipulation, suppression of dissent, isolati, beneath the surface of Sacred Heart. Seminary's twisted history lies a connection to shadowy networks far more sinister than anyone dared imagine. These were not merely isolated criminals or corrupt priests. They were pawns and players in a sprawling web of power manipulation that reached deep into the fabric of 19th century America and beyond. Behind closed doors, alliances were forged between ecclesiastical authorities and influential political figures. The seminary's wealthiest patrons, those who funded its gleaming stone walls and grand libraries, were not just devout Catholics. Many harbored ambitions to consolidate power through control of both the spiritual and secular realms. Religion became a tool, not a refuge, for the ambitious. This symbiotic relationship allowed dark agendas to flourish unchecked. The disappearances at Sacred Heart were whispers of a larger machinery, one that trafficked souls for influence, coerced loyalty for political gain, and suppressed any truth threatening the status quo. Evidence suggests that these disappearances were a precursor to a covert system of recruitment and control, funneling broken men into roles where they could serve the hidden rulers of society. Seminary halls became recruitment centers, not for spiritual leaders, but for operatives trained to manipulate communities, influence decisions, and silence opposition. This is the dark underbelly of institutional religion and power, a place where faith is weaponized, where morality is twisted into obedience, and where freedom is sacrificed on the altar of control. But the story doesn't end here. These patterns repeat across time and geography. The structures of control learned at Sacred Heart laid a foundation for future abuses, hidden beneath layers of tradition and dogma. To truly understand the scale of this corruption, one must follow the trail beyond the seminary wall. The disappearances did not stop. Each vanishing was cloaked in plausible lies, whispered excuses, and carefully constructed alibis. But beneath the surface, a darker truth was clawing its way out, a truth of corruption so deep that it infected the very soul of the institution. Sacred Heart Seminary was no sanctuary. It was a labyrinth of control, deceit, and silent suffering. The three men who had seized power here were no priests. They were predators, wearing holy masks to hide their monstrous intent. Students who questioned too much vanished. Those who grew suspicious were isolated, broken down by a system designed to crush resistance. Letters never reached families. Prayers echoed hollow in empty halls. And outside, the world remained blissfully unaware, or unwilling to believe the nightmare unfolding in the heart of America's religious establishment. The Vatican's silence was deafening. The Church had reasons to bury the truth, reasons tied to power, reputation, and a centuries-old fear of scandal. Sacred Heart became a tomb, not just for the missing, but for justice itself. Men who entered as hopeful seekers of divine purpose were reduced to shadows, their fates sealed behind walls no one dared breach. Tonight, as you listen, understand this. Power thrives in darkness, but light exists even in the deepest shadows. The question is whether you will choose to see it or continue to live in comfortable ignorance. If you are ready to awaken to truths hidden for generations, to break free from the chains of deception, then your journey is only beginning. Remember the phrase, I embrace the hidden truth. Type it twice in the comments below. Let this be your declaration, your first step toward seeing beyond the veil. The walls of Sacred Heart Seminary held more than just stone and mortar. They concealed a network of lies, fear, and silent complicity. The missing priests were not isolated incidents, but pieces of a sinister puzzle that extended far beyond the seminary's grounds. Whispers of secret shipments, shadowy figures, and unmarked graves began circulating among those few brave enough to investigate. Yet every lead was met with dead ends, every question with evasions cloaked in holy rhetoric. The operation wasn't just about abduction. It was a system of psychological control so precise and ruthless that it transformed hopeful young men into broken souls, lost to the world and swallowed by darkness. The false priests wielded their authority like weapons, bending doctrine and faith to serve a cruel agenda. They controlled not only bodies but minds, rewriting reality for those trapped within the seminary's walls. This was institutional manipulation at its most grotesque. A sacred institution twisted into a tool of terror, its mission corrupted by greed, power, and cruelty. The very faith that should have offered sanctuary became a cage, and the chains were forged in secrecy. But the question remains, how deep does this rot run? How many more have been sacrificed in silence, buried beneath layers of deceit so thick that even time struggles to unravel them? You are not merely a witness to this story. You are a participant in uncovering a history they tried to erase. The truth is a double-edged sword. Once grasped, it can never be forgotten. Brace yourself. The descent into forbidden knowledge grows darker still. The veil of silence surrounding Sacred Heart Seminary began to lift in the decades that followed, but not through official channels. It was through the whispered testimonies of descendants, hidden diaries, and secret letters uncovered in dusty attics that the true horror leaked out. Stories emerged of shadowy figures arriving in the dead of night, cloaked and silent, hauling away the lost young priests. Some spoke of underground tunnels beneath the seminary, forgotten passageways leading to unmarked graves in the woods beyond. Historians, who dared to dig deeper, were met with institutional stonewalling. Files disappeared, witnesses intimidated, entire archives locked away under Vatican seals. The Church's powerful machinery worked tirelessly to sanitize history, to bury the truth beneath layers of pious lies and sanitized narratives. But these efforts only fueled the fire of suspicion, sparking underground movements dedicated to unveiling the real story. And so, the legend of the 17 priests who vanished became a symbol, a stark reminder that even the most sacred institutions can be corrupted by darkness, that power without accountability breeds monstrosity. These men, once full of faith and promise, were swallowed by a system designed to exploit, silence, and erase. Tonight, you stand at the edge of that abyss. You have glimpsed the shadow beneath the light, the rot behind the ritual. The question now is whether you will turn away or step forward into the dangerous knowledge that changes everything. If you are ready to claim this truth, type in the comments, "Shadow revealed, light unbound." Say it twice. Let it root you in this moment. It is not just a phrase. It is your oath to seek, to question, to awaken. Because once you open this door, there is no going back. This final truth is not for the faint of heart. The story of Sacred Heart Seminary is a mirror reflecting a darker reality that stretches beyond a single institution or century. It reveals the mechanisms of control, fear, and deception that have shaped not only religious authority, but the very fabric of power itself. The 17 missing priests were casualties, victims of a calculated system that thrives in shadows, feeding on silence, built to protect its own survival at any cost. You now understand that history is not just what is written, but what is hidden. What forces conspire to erase voices, memories, and lives. The lies you have been told were crafted with precision, designed to keep you compliant, distracted, and disbelieving. But knowledge is a weapon, and with it comes responsibility. To awaken is to resist. Look closely at the institutions you trust, the leaders you revere, and the stories you accept. Behind the polished facades may lurk unspeakable corruption, ancient conspiracies, and deliberate manipulation designed to bend your mind and soul. This is the nature of power, quiet, relentless, and insidious. Remember the faces of those lost young men, their hopes stolen, their voices silenced. Their disappearance was no accident but a warning, a dark secret that institutions still protect. But now, you hold a fragment of that truth. Carry it carefully and carry it boldly. This is your initiation into the forbidden knowledge few dare to seek. Use it wisely. Share it cautiously, because the deeper you go, the more dangerous it becomes, and the world will never be the same again. Thank you for stepping into the shadows. The path ahead is uncertain, but the truth is yours to claim. If you've embraced this revelation, comment again. Shadow revealed, light unbound. Twice. This is your seal, your transformation, your awakening. The journey has only just begun.